All right, so in this video, I want to show you how to take Cornell notes based on annotations that you've done in biology textbooks. So in the previous video, I showed you how to annotate a textbook. So I would start with the title, put the unit, the lesson, the exploration that you're taking notes on, maybe your name at the top. Now, if you're doing Cornell notes, you want to insert a table that has three uh, sections. And I like to make the left section a little smaller and the right section also a little smaller so that it give you more room in the middle to write my where most of the stuff that I'm writing is actually going to be at. Now, what you want to do on the left side of your table is that you want to put the key term or key idea that you're going to be describing, right? This is usually stuff like the headers are going to give you pointers on what those key ideas might be, or maybe some of those underlined words might point towards those key ideas. In the middle here, I'm literally going to develop that by writing the definitions, explanations of those key ideas. Basically, what is that key idea? Now, that should match the red highlighting from the annotations if you did that. By the way, if you are colorblind, you can always use different colors that actually pop to you to highlight. There's no rule that you have to use red and green. All right, so then on the right side, I'm going to write examples or illustrations to help me visualize what this is talking about. So I might, that's basically matching the green part of my textbook. So hopefully this will help you visualize what you need to do here. So this paragraph that we annotated on the previous video is about boundaries. And so I'm going to write that as my key term. And then I'm going to define what that is. Now, when I'm defining, I'm going to try to do it without uh, just copying from the textbook, but trying to internalize what that means. So putting that in my own words, right? I can reread what the textbook says. And I think it's just basically a separation between the inside and outside of a system. What's the line that separates the inside and outside of a system? And the textbook actually gives me an example of this. It tells me, for example, that a protective covering of a cell phone is a good example of a boundary. Right? But there's like many more examples I can think of, and sometimes I try to think of examples myself. Examples in addition to what a textbook does. That really does help you absorb that information. So maybe you would do something like dam uh, containing a reservoir. That's a decent one. Or maybe the cell membrane is around a cell. Those could all be examples of that. Now, I could actually take this an extra layer and look up or take snapshots of pictures. So let me do a cell membrane. Find a nice little image that I can use here for the cell membrane. Right? So I want to find one that actually shows this idea of boundary, right? So there you go. I can use this picture here to kind of visualize that because it has that clear boundary around the cell. Now, real cells don't look like that, but that gives me an idea of what it is. You don't always have to put a visual, but it helps if you put a visual because it helps it pop for you. So that's an example how you do that. Now let's keep going. I don't always just do one line per paragraph. There might be more than one key idea. So this one also goes into components, right? Which are the parts of a system, right, that interact. And then maybe I want to give examples, right? So the textbook gives examples of the radio, the battery, the screen, you know, the different parts of a cell phone needed to send a text message, right? Maybe you want to add the processing unit, whatever that is, right? They all work together to make that happen. Or in a cell, we can have all the organelles of a cell, right, that work together to help the cell do what it does, right? And again, I can look up pictures to help me visualize that. Now, in the textbook, actually, there is a really nice one of the cell phone. I was going to look up organelles, but I already used the cell in the last one, so I'm actually going to do this. And there you go. Those are the parts, components of a system, giving you visuals. Now, you don't always have to put visuals. They certainly take up a lot of space when you're printing the notes. But visuals can help you, uh, can help that information pop into your head. And so we repeat that process throughout the entire chapter. Now, notice that the green stuff is what I ended up using for my examples, and the red stuff is what I ended up using for my definitions or explanations column. And the underlined words were key because I used those words in my definitions or even to identify my key ideas. Now, when you're actually done with this, I actually did that already for the entire first exploration. You end up with a lot of key terms, right? And you might illustrate some and some others. And that's kind of how the Cornell notes look like. Now, this is good enough to create the Cornell notes, but you might want to go one step further. You might want to put your Cornell notes on hyperdrive, so to speak, right? So what I do to make them to learn even more with my Cornell notes is at the end of my notes. Now, this is something that you take 5 minutes to do, and that's it. You only take 5 minutes, not more, not less. You're basically going to um, write as much as you can about everything that you remember that you learned in those 5 minutes. And you might want to quickly skim through your notes before doing your 5 minute write. But the cool thing is that you will write for 5 minutes and you don't stop. You put a stopwatch, you start that stopwatch. So you get something like this, you set it for 5 minutes, and then you just start it. And until that stopwatch goes off, you keep writing. So I did that here as an example for those notes. You can pause to see if the summary if you want to. Other than that, I like to put the muddiest point. Now, the muddiest point is the part that actually helps me figure out the parts that I least understood. That's things that I might want to ask questions to the teacher or research more about because I didn't really get it as much. As an example, I picked the part on feedbacks and controls of the first exploration because it was the hardest part when I was learning this. By the way, the reason to do the summary in the muddiest point is because when you do the summary, the stuff that you remember to write in those 5 minutes is probably what you least need to review. And the stuff that you get wrong or forget to write about is the stuff that you want to review the most. That even helps you find the muddiest point. Underneath the muddiest point, you might want to do a section called questioning. Now, in this questioning section, what you want to do is write down questions that you may have because you're curious about, you want to learn more, or even questions that you created in the process of like acting like a teacher and try to come up with test questions. I'm going to make a separate video about an activity that I always encourage students to do to practice called Higher Order Questioning Guide, where you actually act like a teacher and come up with 5 questions about the topic. So this is kind of like doing that activity within the notes that you do. You know, there's no limit to how many questions you come up with. Here in the example, I have some that come from my curiosity and some that are just straight up me acting like a teacher to come up with questions. Now, watch that separate video if you want to be good at coming up with questions, right? And sometimes it's just things that when you were reading, it's like, I want to learn more about that. The last thing that I would add in my notes is this section on connections. Now, there's 3 types of connections you might want to do. There's the importance, the application, and the opinion. And for the importance, you want to talk about like, why do we learn about this? Why is this in a biology textbook? Why do we care about this? Why should I care for my own life? And you can see an example of how I did that for the first exploration, you know. And application is kind of similar to that. It's like, oh, how might I use this in real life? Or how might a scientist use this in real life? And then finally, opinion is more like, what did I think about this lesson? What did it meant to me? Did I like it? Why or why not? Engaging in these connection activities can help you care more about the topic and remember it better because you're building bridges in your brain. And engaging in the questioning part, I forgot to mention, you might want to do that because when you act like a teacher and force yourself to think of questions that might be asked in a test or could be asked in a test, you again set yourself up to succeed by paying attention to the more important parts of the lesson. And again, do you want to do this whole process every time? Do you really need it? I have a different video where I talk about how to decide how involved to get your study process to be, but I'd say Cornell Notes will help you. right? But the better question is, how much help do you actually need? And I also want to remind you that I would actually do the entire set of annotations first, read the entire textbook, and then worry about taking notes, and that I could use for study. And sometimes I might suggest that you skip the notes and actually do the workbook questions, the golden questions that show up in the textbook, because those questions can actually serve as bonus evidence of mastery, which is something that you need to get good grades in my class. And so you might as well do that first to guarantee that bonus, and then worry about creating notes that you might use to study for a quiz on the content, which is worth less than skill mastery, right? But whether you do these notes before or after you look at those golden questions, or whether you do the notes at all, or do the golden questions at all, uh, it's up to you, really. But I think that doing Cornell notes and uh, even these extra steps that I mentioned at the end can help you strengthen your retention and understanding of the topic. How much of that you need, it's really up to you. It depends on you. So if you're struggling, you know now these different kinds of skills that you can add. Think of it as a toolbox. How many tools you pick up from the toolbox is really up to you. And by the way, I want to add that you might want to actually take notes by hand, right? There's advantages of doing this. For starters, if you have notes already physically in front of you, not on a computer screen, you can do them to create a foldable. And I'll talk more about that when I tell you how to study with the Cornell Notes um, in a different video. But you also rehearse more with your brain because you're also engaging in writing. And there's research that shows that if you do that, it improves your retention. So it's okay to type, but it's even better if you actually do notes like this on paper. So I strongly recommend it. So this is Cornell Notes, including some extra stuff to put on the bottom to spice up your notes even more. I hope you find this helpful. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how you can use these notes to actually study afterwards.